We're going to talk today about some tips to help you prevent fraud and minimise risk as part of your tenancy progression process. I am Jo Dickens. I am Head of Business Development for the Barban Group, which incorporates HomeLet and Let Alliance. And I'm joined by my colleague Becky.
Hi everyone, Rebecca Baker. I'm Head of Customer Operations here at Barban and work closely with Jo to support all of our letting agent customers across all of our brands. Lovely to have you today.
Yeah, thanks for joining. So as I said, we're going to be talking to you today about some of the things that we feel you can do to help to safeguard your lettings business. We all know, I think, as agents who have come across this, and also for ourselves as a referencing provider and rent guarantee provider, that fraud is massively on the increase in property and specifically in property rentals. So we want to try and help you prevent fraud, minimize the risk of fraud. It can strike when you least expect it. You know, are you prepared? People who could seem incredibly legitimate, people who can seem on the face of it like the nicest potential tenants you've ever dealt with. It is staggering the cases that we are finding where we've had things like documents that have been doctored and changed for the purposes of getting a rental property. So we're going to talk about some steps to help prevent fraud in lettings, some key warning signs and how to spot those early on, and some strategies to protect your business from the financial risk of fraud. Because as we know, if the worst happens and it does all go wrong, it will be your landlord client who's going to be coming back and saying to you as their agent, well, what happened? How did this very, very bad person move into my rental property? Quick stat from Action Fraud, which is really helpful to use with landlords, with prospective landlords, because I'm not sure that any of them are really aware of the risks that fraud presents to them at the moment. So in the UK, property fraud cases increased by 45% in the last 5 years. So, I mean, that is absolutely massive. And what we thought we would do in terms of setting the scene is Becky's going to share with you a couple of examples of situations whereby we've seen and been able to prevent some serious fraud.
Thank you, Jo. I think just as a small addition to my introduction, so I've been working within Barban for coming up to 18 years now, and I really have seen it all when it comes to the lengths that some people will go to bypass the checks that we do, that you do in your agency offices as well. And the scale at which people might do this can range from a few small adjustments here and there just to try and conceal or mask funds, all with the intention of paying the rent, but they want a property that's maybe slightly outside of their price range, to the complete other end of the scale, which is organised crime. You know, there's networks of individuals changing information, working together in order to access your landlord's properties. So actually just pulling out a couple of case studies was quite difficult because there are many to choose from. But the ones that we are going to talk about in a bit more detail today will just give you a bit of a flavour of what it was that happened, what the individual tenant was trying to do, and then some of the checks that our team did in addition to our normal process to support and combat this. So the first one I'm going to talk about was a property in London. The rent was £1,950 a month, so, you know, roughly what you would expect in London. And it was a 36-month tenancy that this person was applying for. On their application, they'd listed themselves as an accountant, but they were working for a food produce company, a relatively small food produce company, earning £63,000 a year. So there were some alarm bells there. You know, to our team, that felt out of the norm as to what you would expect. So it came out of the normal process. Team members then requested some additional documents to support. And often when we request multiple different documents to try and triangulate, you will often find something isn't adding up, isn't stacking up. So we requested the bank statements from the applicant in this instance. And when we then looked at the bank statements in more detail, the payments weren't tallying up with the transaction names that were listed in those bank statements. We were seeing some payments coming in and out at days of the week that you wouldn't expect. There were signs of direct debits being bounced back due to insufficient funds, when actually you look at the balances that were available on those dates, the balances were more than enough to cover the funds going. So that level of detail was needed to spot some of these people. So it's things like that you need a human. So where we talk about our people, our data, and our technology, this is where the people element was absolutely necessary in this, because it needed a team member to have a gut feel of, this feels out of the norm, I'm going to do some additional checks, and then looking at that bank statement in that level of detail. And what the individual had done is they'd kind of used the PDF copy of the bank statement but converted it into an image. So sometimes it's more difficult to analyze some of the text because it doesn't look like text in that image. So it needed that expert eye from one of our team members. The application was declined, and our letting agent was absolutely thrilled that we'd done that additional level of check, and we'd educated them as to what we'd found for next time. The average rent, just to call out on the applications that we are finding, is around £1,500 a month. So just over the UK average of sort of £1,200, £1,300 at the moment. So £18,000 a year, in annualised rent. This next one was slightly higher than that. So this next case was a case in Mayfair. The rent was just shy of £4,500. The property was in a sought-after location, obviously very desirable, and had recently been valued at 3.5 million. So a huge asset to this landlord. The individual that had come through for referencing had no credit file, despite living at the address in the UK for over 3 years. So immediately that is suspicious. With, many things that people do now, leaving a footprint on your credit file, and with Barban accessing the full credit file, which can see credit commitments, credit cards, loans, etc., it's quite unusual now for someone to have lived in the UK for that period of time and be invisible from a credit file point of view. So that meant we requested additional documents as well. Some of the documents, not all, were bank statements again. We utilise technology now that analyses documents and the metadata contained within them. So the metadata is more around the structure of the document and things that you can't often see to the naked eye. These bank statements showed that they had been heavily edited, and they were providing different information over and above what was actually happening in those documents, and we were able to pick that up. The applicant had also created a fake email address and a fake website associated with the employer that they declared on their application form, which is another real trigger for us from a fraud perspective. And we have checks that are in place that then tell us when that email address was created. And in this instance, it was 20 days prior to the reference. So when you then combine that with information that's publicly available about how long the business has been in existence, that is a red flag, and we take steps to protect people from that as well. The bank statements were templates that had been, every single field had been filled in for the purposes of passing referencing as well. And it's safe to say that application was declined. So these are just a couple of examples of what we've seen. This is in the last 2 weeks, and what people are trying to do to bypass some of these checks. And we go on a few more slides time to show you some of the examples in front of you as well, so you can see the power of the technology that we're utilising today.
Absolutely. And I think it's important also to understand that the fraud is coming from a number of different areas. As Becky alluded to before, you've got applicants who perhaps don't earn as much as they would need to hit the affordability on paper, as it were. And we're therefore asking them for things like evidence of additional savings to top up that income. We know that rents are on the increase. We know that people are experiencing cost of living difficulties. So often they want to make themselves look like the most appealing person to be able to secure the rental property. And that's where we see some of that fraud coming from. The other side of it, of course, is the criminal activity side of things. So people who are wanting to obtain properties to use them as private clubs, to use them as brothels, to use them as cannabis farms. These are all things that will involve fraud in order to be able to obtain the tenancy, and could potentially lead to huge damages in the property, a lot of upset from neighbours and things like that, which is obviously reputational risk for you as the agent, and also a massive risk to the landlord. So we need to work together, I think it's fair to say, to try to prevent this. As a referencing company, we don't meet these people, but we are obviously making sure that we're doing appropriate checks when cases are submitted to us, for us to do our job. I said before that Action Fraud had seen a massive increase in property related fraud. We are seeing fraud increasing by up to a third in the last year, and we are flagging over 150 cases a day for additional investigations within our referencing team. We have declined over 1,500 cases. And if we were to look at those cases that we have declined and made the assumption that those individual tenants had moved into those properties and those tenancies had gone ahead, had they have then all gone wrong, it would normally take at least 12 months to be able to get those tenants out of those properties and recover possession for the landlord. And the cost of that would have been a quite staggering £27 million in annualised rent, and that's in 2024 year to date. So that's going to easily top over 30 million in 2024. So we'd like to share with you now a couple of the examples, as we alluded to, on some of the document checking that we've got. So Becky, I'll hover for you over the bits that you tell me to.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. And then Jason, I see you've asked a question in the chat, which we can come on to onto in a moment. So what you're looking at the screen here is just a couple of snippets of some of the cases that we've seen and some of the technology that we use, which whenever we talk to our customers about this, it really does hit home about, you know, we talk about, oh, to the untrained eye, these things can look difficult to spot, but even to the trained eye, some of this is actually becoming really difficult to spot as well. So on the left-hand side, Jo, if my handy assistant can just direct to the left-hand side, this is just a screenshot of a typical bank statement that I'm sure will be familiar with you all. So you can see the dates, you can see the transaction reference numbers, the amounts coming in, the amounts going out, and then the balances. So before some of this technology, you would have team members analysing this, doing some simple additions to say, right, does the running balance add up based on what's coming in and going out? So you'd sometimes be able to find some inconsistencies that way. We now have technology that does this for us. So to the right-hand side of your screen, you can then see that this bank statement is lit up like a Christmas tree, where it's highlighting to the team member that there's a risk associated with this document. So clearly high-risk document, it says that on the left-hand side. We're then provided with a panel that breaks down the various aspects of that document that are suspicious for us to look into in more detail. And on this one, this is where I talk about trained versus untrained eye. This one is more about the fonts that have been used. So because of this process that we have, it knows what to expect from a Lloyds bank statement, a HSBC bank statement. It understands any changes that have been made by the bank and continually learns, and it can tell us any fonts that are associated only with fraudulent documents. And it knows this by looking at fonts that are associated maybe with Photoshop software as an example. So this one, the transaction, you can see the name there, Julia Carroll, it's highlighting that this font is not in keeping with the document and this is what is suspicious. So this is where somebody has potentially edited and added this information into a template to make it look like they're receiving funds to satisfy their referencing. There's many other flags that it can provide within this document. It can tell us what software it's been used to edit. It can, you know, highlight where edits have been made and tell us what it said previously as well. Thanks, Jo. You've just gone on to the next example here. So some of you will be aware this is a self-employment tax return. So from this, we're using these in instances where someone says to us they are self-employed and having to submit declarations of their own earnings. And on the left-hand side, you've got the document that had been sent to us. And you can see there that the earnings were declared at just short of £750,000 in that year. What you can then see in the panel on the right-hand side, if you can just hover over, Jo, the metadata area, this is where it actually tells our team members what the text said previously. So again, to the trained eye, this would have said £750,000. What you see that was highlighted there was underneath that, this person actually only had an income of just shy of 13,000 in the year. So they have used an editing software to provide a highly inflated level of earnings in order to pass their referencing checks. A team member looking at that with the naked eye would not have found that. This software has helped that, and this application was then subsequently declined. And we see these, you know, tens and tens of these every single day where people are getting clever. And some of this information, just to add, is added right at the start of the application without any prompting. You might get some tenants that send us everything without even being asked for it. You'll get some tenants that provide nothing and wait to be asked. And you know, we're just starting to analyse the trends there as to, is there more happening where people give us everything up front, more happening where we have to ask for it and they've then got time to edit? It's at the moment, it's a little bit 50-50, but people are learning and trying to kind of stay one step ahead. And software like this means that is becoming almost impossible for them to do that. There was a question from...
oh, go on. Do you want to take the question,
chat.
Becky?
Yeah, so Jason's asked, do you decline people with no credit history where they've been here for 3 years? Not necessarily, Jason. Not always. We will sometimes. We will do some challenges to understand why. Some people might have, if they're a little bit older, in an older generation, there's some people that are not always as up present on the credit file. There might be some people that are a little bit younger. So someone might have lived at an address for a couple of years with parents just turned 18. So there might be some mitigating factors that mean they don't have a credit file, but we will do some of that analysis, conversations with the tenant to understand why. And we will also request some documents to prove, like a driving license, is the address correct? So we're trying to prove, and actually in some instances, we can then find a credit file. It's more about how the person's filled in their application. So in an example, a student might say, well, I've put my student's address for the last 2 years, but I'm actually registered at home. We can amend the address at home to be able to find a credit file. So we're doing a lot more up front to actually track down that credit file. If we then find that we really can't, we will then put some warnings on the report just to make you aware to maybe do your additional checks if there's nothing that we can find to prove it either way.
Thanks, Becky.
Thanks, Jo.
That's great. So we've talked obviously about some case studies when things do go wrong. We've shown you some live examples of some of the technology. But as I alluded to before, it's really important that, this is about us helping you as letting agents and very much working together. So we would always encourage you to make sure that you are meeting tenants and guarantors in person. It's also worth considering doing social media checks and things like that of your own. Obviously, things like that can't necessarily influence a referencing process, but especially if you're renting properties to tenants in a local area, it's very possible that you'll be bumping into these people in the supermarket. So, potentially considering doing those sorts of checks is incredibly helpful. Guarantors, especially, we have come across circumstances where we have had a guarantor been put through for referencing, and actually it transpires that the guarantor has never given permission to the tenant to be used as that guarantor. So actually making sure that you are meeting that guarantor and getting their consent to stand as guarantor and to sign the documentation is really, really important. With fraud cases, we often see situations whereby if someone has been successful in moving into a property, it then transpires that they might have paid their initial funds, so their rent and their security deposit, via a credit or debit card. And obviously, if that card has been used fraudulently, that money can actually be clawed back from you. So try to insist on bank transfers for initial funds. And it goes without saying, avoid cash. We would always say be suspicious of people who are trying to give you large upfront payments. Quite often we will see that people who want to try and circumnavigate the referencing and vetting process will try to pay a lump sum of 6 months or 12 months in advance to try and avoid those checks and move into that property very, very quickly. So again, always insist that you want to do your own pre-tenancy checks before they are actually allowed to move in and collect the keys.
Sorry,
Something
Jo,
that
it's
we,
worth just
yeah,
highlighting as well. It is about some of the urgency of these people as well. So, coming to you today, I need to move in by this weekend. They'll give you the story behind it, but it's really just checking that the story that they're providing you really does stack up. So is there really that urgent need to move in? You have to just question why there's that urgency.
Yeah, and we see it as well, don't we, Becky? So if we have had situations where perhaps we've had an individual who is trying to act fraudulently, they can be straight on the phone, they can be very pushy,
Yeah.
they can be, almost quite bullying to team members to be able to try and get those references passed through very quickly. And the likelihood is they'll be showing very similar behaviours with your negotiators, with your branch teams.
Yeah.
Some things that we've seen as common signs of potential cannabis farming or cannabis factories being created are people who will ask about bills being included, people who will go to the viewing and check the accessibility of the property. They'll be checking to see where the electric supply is coming into the property, so that they can potentially look at bypassing that supply and, obviously avoiding having to pay anything for the electric that they're going to be using excessive amounts of. The likelihood is they'll refuse access for inspections. They'll change the locks. There could be building materials appearing around the house. So we had cases whereby within literally a couple of days of collecting the keys, somebody has then had excessive amounts of building materials around the property, to obviously start creating a cannabis factory. And blacked out windows, excessive heat, lots of like comings and goings, lots of different people in and out, with it not seeming like anybody's actually living in there. Extractor fans, pungent smells. As I said, these are all signs potentially of illegal use, for drug factories. We mentioned before tenants who are pushy, tenants who are determined to secure the tenancy as fast as possible by whatever means necessary, often getting quite aggressive. That again can be a sign that there is something, just something not quite right. And of course, with you as managing agents, you are the people who are going to be managing this property and doing the inspections in the future. So it's important that you're also using your experience to make sure you're getting the best, securing the best quality tenants. It goes without saying, I'd always recommend utilising a credit referencing partner for your checks. But if you're doing your own checks internally, just make sure you verified the source of those references. It is very easy now for people to actually just buy a set of bank statements and a set of pay slips online. And we see that more and more through our AI tool, because the AI tool is actually learning all the time and starting to recognize those documents that are literally being duplicated multiple times over, simply with different people's names on them. So those are all things to really, really watch out for. And then we also would like to cover off some of the essential tips to, as I said, minimize risk. So educate your teams on the dangers of fraudulent applications and the problems that can arise from non-payment of rent, cannabis farms, adult clubs, subletting. These people are often part of much larger criminal gangs, and can be, um, partaking in fraud and potentially making and costing your landlords tens of thousands of pounds. Um, it is really important that your team members understand those risks, because as you can imagine, we're all up against it, right? We're all trying to let properties and get tenants into properties and secure great rental returns for the landlords, but not at the detriment of really getting the best quality of tenants. I mentioned before, referencing partners, try to consider one who has invested in technology, people, and checking various elements of legitimacy of the referencing process. Meet the tenants, verify who they are. You could consider solutions as well that are currently available, such as IDVT. IDVT helps you to remotely or virtually verify the identity and liveness of the individual that you're actually dealing with. So within our solution, as an example, we do what we call a liveness check. So the technology will ask the individual to take a big smile. That confirms then that you've got that live individual with their identity document in their presence via a video link, and that will allow us to confirm remotely the identity of that individual.
And just to add on to that, Joe, as well, just where we can provide that imagery on a final report, it's just making sure, is that the person that you're giving the keys to? Because that's the person we're saying we verified as part of the reference as well. So it's just making sure that all of the dots are joined up here as well. Yeah,
correct. I mentioned before things like collecting funds through bank transfer as opposed to card payment or cash. It's terrible to see, especially if we end up in a rent guarantee claim situation whereby someone has been allowed to move into a property, they've paid their initial funds via a credit or debit card, and those are covered by the chargeback guarantee. So just consider your processes when you are actually collecting payments of, potentially quite large sums of money in advance. And also consider appropriate insurances for you and your landlords that can protect you if the worst happens. For you as letting agents, make sure that you're appropriately covered if something does go wrong through things like your professional indemnity insurance. Speak to your landlords, make sure that they have buildings and contents insurance in place that can appropriately protect them against the risk of something going wrong. Make sure you've spoken to them about things like rent protection, about things like legal cover, so that if the worst does happen, your landlord and you have at least got the best protection that you can possibly have. So another little stat, because these are always helpful, I think, when speaking to your landlords, when trying to educate your landlords. Property Mark stat, the average cost of resolving a single fraudulent tenancy case can exceed £30,000. We also see this with some examples of claims on our buildings and contents insurance. We've seen claims, for example, on malicious damage in excess of £50,000 for rectifying the damage done by someone who has turned the property into a cannabis farm. So I hope this has been useful and just given you some insights into some of the things that we've learnt in what we're doing day to day to help protect tenants and landlords. My contact details are on this pack. Becky's contact details are on this pack. So if there are any questions, we will open the floor now for a couple of minutes for if there's any questions that anyone would like to pop into the chat. But otherwise, we are available via email, via phone directly if you'd like to reach out to us on a one-to-one basis. Not sure if there's anything you wanted to add, Becky?
Yeah, I was just going to say, while we're just waiting to see if any questions do come in, where you are using a referencing partner, hopefully we are one of them, but it's working together with us. So you meet the individuals, we don't. We will speak to them and we'll converse by email, for example. But if you've met somebody and you just can't quite put your finger on a suspicion, please do let us know as well. So there might be something that you've seen that you're just wanting us to kind of delve into in a bit more detail. We're more than happy to work with you on that, given that you will have met the individual and seen them in person. And I think just important to what you mentioned, Joe, where you provide some of the statistics around the 1,500, year to date that we've declined. Because of the size of our organisation, we will then feed that back into our own databases so that we don't let these people get through again. And I know in some of your bullet points, Joe, you talk about the subletting risk. So we are typically seeing, some subletters are coming back around for referencing every 2 to 3 months. And because we're already aware of a large number of these, they're cross-checked against that database and they're pulled out of the general process before we let them go any further. So when you're dealing with a referencing provider that's got some scale and some numbers and seeing this data, a more granular level detail, we have the power to be able to, highlight these and stop these going forward.
Thanks, Becky. So there's a couple of questions that have just popped into the chat. So I'll read those out and we can answer them on here as well. Does the right to rent check suffice for ID verification? So as we know, in England, there is obviously a requirement for you to check the right to rent of the individual. You do need to obviously check the document. Sorry. You do obviously need to check the document in the presence of the holder. As Becky said, you need to be able to evidence that the right to rent evidence that you have seen matches the individual that you are moving into that property. Now, for people who are moving, who are British or Irish passport holders, IDVT technology can help you to do that remotely. And obviously, you have got the share code process as well. We would always recommend that, aside from checking your right to rent, that you as agents also have another proof of identity on the individual as well before you do hand the keys over to them, and that obviously you've checked that to make sure it does represent a true likeness of the person that or people that are actually moving into the property. And we've just got a question about rent guarantee in Northern Ireland. because of the laws being different with evictions. Yes, we as a provider do offer rent guarantee in Northern Ireland, and we have partners that we work with over there. And Nadine, you have asked, with some tenancies, there can be a falling out with the tenant and guarantor. How do we stand with the guarantor no longer wanting to act? Getting a little bit into the sort of tenancy legal side of things here, effectively when the guarantor is signing that deed of guarantee or the guarantor section in the tenancy agreement, they are then contractually liable to act as that guarantor for that term. It would be down to you guys to be speaking to the tenant, speaking to the guarantor, and seeing if there is some kind of negotiation that can take place to ever get a replacement guarantor, or to perhaps see at the end of the original term whether that tenant was to be able to pass referencing in their own right. We've got another webinar next week. My colleague Blake has kindly put a note in the chat about that webinar. That is on tips to maximise revenue to your business and reduce administration. Again, free to join. So we hope that if you found this one useful, do feel free to join that one. And Lisa has asked, this is quite a good question actually, is the rogue applicant shared on a wider database?
Want me to take this one, Jo?
Yeah, why don't you take that one, Becky? Because I know you'll want to mention SciFAS and things like that.
Yeah. So thank you, Lisa, for the question. So the database that I was referring to, we have internal databases so that it kind of just augments the process that we use day to day. Obviously, there are some data protection things to consider here about where else we share that. But we do work with other organisations. Jo's referred to one. One is SciFAS. So that stands for Credit Industry Fraud Avoidance System. So where we've got a confirmed case of fraud, we have a duty to share that applicant back onto that database. That links into the credit check. So other members of SciFAS, so typically your banks, mortgage providers, loan providers, some other referencing providers may use that. And that data is then consulted when that application goes through. So it doesn't just stop it from a referencing point of view. If that person is then trying to apply for any other financial services in future, where they are a member of SciFAS, they will receive an alert to say, Barban have had some suspicions. What were the suspicions? Was it a bank statement? Was it an identity? What level of depth does that go into? And we are able to have some conversations if ever there are questions raised. So that kind of does get shared more widely, but it's not a database where you can just kind of casually type in a search to see if there's a hit. You have to be completing a search on that individual for a financial purpose. So yes, it is shared more widely in that regard, but not something that would be visible to letting agents as an example, because it could just be used in ways that we probably wouldn't support and endorse.
And I think that kind of covers off the question that we've had from Gulston as well, which was, if you noticed a fraudulent application, would you tell the police if you felt necessary, or cancel the application and move on? So no, not the police, but as Becky said, they will be flagged on our internal databases, and we will be reporting them back into SciFAS as well.
And it's worth noting, links into probably Gulston's point there. So where SciFAS also, they monitor the network. So if they have lots of loadings in a similar area where there are some similarities, they will often provide cases through to action fraud as well. So they are doing that on behalf of the wider, financial sector.